Today, we revisit one of the most gruesome episodes of India's history. I'm talking about the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. If you look at the headlines from that time, they tell their own story of the carnage that took place at the hands of the man who came to be known as the Butcher of Amritsar. I'm talking, of course, about General Dyer, who actually lost his rank after the massacre, but that's what he was known as all his life. A refurbished brand new museum today stands at the place of the massacre, pictures shared by the Prime Minister himself. But there's so much that we still don't know about that massacre. In particular, the heroism of the ordinary men and women of Amritsar who stood up to the British. Those stories now captured in a new book by diplomat author Navtej Sarna. Let's go across now to Ambassador Sarna, who captures eloquently and poignantly a Punjab of a time gone by. I was up all weekend reading it, and it is eloquent, it is poignant, and it is powerful. Thank you very much, Navtej, and congratulations on the book. Many people have asked you, why fiction? This is the space of historical fiction, and you've already said that the way you can imagine characters, the way you can imagine the inner life of people can't be done through history and non-fiction, perhaps. But your book really tells the story of also the ordinary men and women of Amritsar who stood up to the British, whose stories are not so well known. How did you come to think of writing their story? We know about Bhagat Singh, we know about Udham Singh, we know about the Gadar party. Well, some of us know some stuff about them, but very little is known about the spirit of Amritsar at the time.
Well, thank you, Barkha. Always a pleasure discussing books with you. We've done this in the past, and I'm so happy we can do this again. You're absolutely right. I mean, the book does focus a lot on very ordinary people, unknown people, most of them fictional characters. Of course, some of them, mingle with actual historical characters. But the essential the material, if I may say so, comes through when you read the testimonies of hundreds of ordinary people to the Gandhi or the Congress Inquiry Commission, which sat in parallel to the Hunter Committee after the massacre. And that's when normal, ordinary people, victims, witnesses, survivors, all came forth and gave their testimony as to what happened. So when I was reading that, I wanted to tell their stories in some way or the other. And along with that was a fact that Jallianwala Bagh was not a discrete, standalone incident in itself in Punjab. There were other things happening against the sort of backdrop of the freedom struggle. There was the Rowlett Act. There were the soldiers coming home from fighting in the First World War. There were the Gadar revolutionaries or the survivors of the Gadar revolutionaries, because by 1915, the Gadar Revolution or the conspiracy had more or less been stamped out. So I realized that all these currents were actually mingling in a way at Jallianwala Bagh or at Amritsar or in Punjab of that period. And then they were streaming out from there. They were streaming out as the Gurdwara reform movement. They were streaming out as the stronger non-cooperation movement. So somehow all these things came together. And when you have to imagine characters, it's so much better if you can imagine ordinary people and their lives.
Well, it's a powerful welding of fiction and non-fiction in this book. But what really struck me, and I think today we don't pause to consider this, is that before Jallianwala Bagh, you actually describe sort of a kind of routineness to the presence of the British. In fact, you talk about a character who's just returned from the Great War. You talk about others who have come to maybe accept that the British are here and one has to make the best of the situation, and people are just living their everyday lives as soldiers, as shopkeepers, as farmers, and what have you. And it's Jallianwala Bagh that really changes in a way, and I think you've said this elsewhere, not just the attitude of Mahatma Gandhi to the British, but also the attitude of ordinary Punjabis who till then maybe are not entirely revulsed or are more fatalistic about the presence of the British.
Yes, you're absolutely right again, because, Punjab, in fact, after the annexation of Punjab 70 years before Jallianwala Bagh, there was a gradual takeover of the erstwhile kingdom of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, in the sense of not just physical takeover, but, an owning of the space. And a lot of people, for instance, were taken into military regiments. The canal movement came out, and the agriculture was reformed. A lot of people were given free land in the wilderness to go and green it, because water was then available. So there were ordinary people were living with the regime. Everybody was not a revolutionary. Everybody was not a freedom fighter. There were clerks, there were pleaders, there were vakils, there were small engineers or superintendents in the canal department. I mean, I go back to my own grandfather, both my grandfathers worked, one in the military dairy farms and one in the irrigation department. But then in revulsion, he resigned. So, you had situations like this, and even the political leadership. The political leadership was largely moderate. I mean, there was a revolutionary fringe, if I may call it that, but the political leadership was moderate, and they believed that, dealing with the British in a civilized manner would bring benefits, and there would be a gradual evolution of the system. And the British were putting forward reforms of a very minimal nature. The Montagu-Chelmsford, or the Montford reforms as they were called, had just been thought up and were being put out in a gradual manner when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. But after that, it became very clear, after the Rowlett Act and Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the martial law, that this was not a regime you could appease. This was not a regime which would recognize that if you went and sent 1 million soldiers and some into the World War I trenches, then there would be a reward. To the contrary, when they returned, they found the Rowlett Act, they found the martial law. So it did change a lot of ordinary people. The Satyagraha gained a lot of movement. The Swadeshi movement gained a lot of momentum. So all that came in its wake.
And there's a kind of ironic, almost funny moment in the book where the mix-up, which even today is made repeatedly, between General Dyer, the actual executioner of the shooting on innocent Indians, who's not really a general, as you explain subsequently, and of course the politician Michael O'Dwyer, who is assassinated by Udham Singh later. And it's common to mix up these two men as if they are one. And one of the characters in your book, using a Hindi expletive, then says, couldn't they find another name? They're all called Dyers. They're all called Dwyers. But tell us a little bit about this butcher of Amritsar, as he's called, the general who loses his rank, actually seeks then to retain a kind of honorary rank after he loses his rank. What did your research tell us about this man? We have all grown up hating, loathing this man, but we don't really know him, if it makes sense.
Yes, he's not a particularly good man to know.
Correct.
So, in a way, in the sense, he spent his childhood in India. His father was the founder of the famous, what is today the Mohan Meekan Brewery in Solan. It was the Dyer brewery. His father began to brew beer in Mussoorie, in Kasoli, in Solan, in Rawalpindi, and very successfully. That time beer had to be brought from across the waters, and it used to spoil. And then he grew up here. He could speak Hindustani. He was very, very familiar with India. And there are, people who have argued in his favor that he was actually very well inclined towards Indians. But that all is that a hagiographic fiction which came immediately after the massacre. But then he was a hardcore imperial soldier. He went to Ireland. He got military training. He came back here, and there was something psychotic about him, because he rushed into Amritsar when all this was happening. In fact, it's been argued by very serious researchers that there never really was an order for him to go to Amritsar. He was in Jalandhar. He was commanding a brigade in Jalandhar, and he landed up there. And then they created this fiction that, no, so and so called me. And then he immediately took over control, and the situation was such, and Michael O'Dwyer, their names may have been mixed up and slightly different, but they were actually both. Michael O'Dwyer was cut from the same cloth. He was from Ireland. He had a vicious hatred of what he called nationalists, and he actually approved the action the very next day on the very minimal report that Dyer sent, that maybe 200-300 people died. And I was under this impression that the crowd was going to attack me and overcome my little force, so I had to fire. Now, gradually he changed his story, and he said, no, it was my duty to fire and teach the entire province a lesson, not just these people. And I had to teach them a lesson. He almost made it a religious duty. So he changed his story. And then, of course, under a lot of pressure, from Gandhi and the other leaders from here, who started peppering London for an inquiry, and from the British liberal sections of the media and the politicians, they had to put an inquiry. And essentially because of Edwin Montagu, who was Secretary of State of India and was very clearly hated Michael O'Dwyer. So they set up the Hunter Committee. And the Hunter Committee, despite the fact that, they were jaundiced, they did not allow several, real Indian witnesses to actually come before them. And they had in 3 people as Indians who gave a minority judgment and a report. And under face of that result of that inquiry, he had to give up his position in India, was retired and sent back home and not given any further appointment. There was an almighty debate in England, in the House of Commons, which sanctioned Dyer to some extent, but the House of Lords went in his favor. So then he got encouraged deep into his retirement that, he had been a brigadier general at the time of the massacre as a temporary rank. And then there is a rule evidently at that time that if you had held temporary rank for a certain time, you could take it as an honorary rank after retirement. But when he applied for that, it had become a hot potato between the War Office and the India Office, and sort of it died a natural death, and as did he.
I'm thinking of you several decades later. Among the countries you represent our country in is the United Kingdom. And before we come to that, this is personal also to some degree for you. Your father, his works of writing have also played their part and contributed to the writing of this book. So speak a little bit about that. Your grandfathers you've spoken about, who were like other common people in Punjab, were working and in employment with the regime, and then left, as you said. What about your father?
My father was born after this massacre, 4 years after the massacre. But we always heard stories about my grandmother, his mother, and how she was there present at the parts of, what come in the book is the lathi charges on the people who were protesting for the reform of the Gurdwaras. And they had adopted the non-violent attitude. So they would go, they would get beaten up, jatha after jatha, get beaten up black and blue by police on horses, and the women would be waiting when they came back to salve them, to massage them, to bandage their wounds, and my grandmother was actually doing that. So we had heard these stories, and then of course we had a very strong sense at home of how the entire movement had also evolved into a kind of revival of Sikh identity, education, the Sikh politics of the time in Punjab, and then of course how the entire composite Punjab was destroyed by partition. And there were these days, the times when you could have this complete religious harmony people used to talk of, and then how gradually as the time of partition came, and reduced itself to bloody riots, and the riots and partition on which my father wrote extensively. So all this was in many ways stuff that you encountered at home, stories, legends,
Yeah.
books.
And
So,
talk and speaking of your grandmother, and speaking also of women, as you said, one of the central characters in the book is Maya Devi, who, and you write in the prologue or the preface about how she's actually drawn from a real life story of Ratan Devi, one of the women who actually wouldn't move till someone came and actually helped her extract her husband, who was among those who was shot by General Dyer's men. The role of women, and not spoken about so much, is interesting to see a central character as female in this book. How did that come about?
well, one is a absolute uh, impossibility to write a book of 300 pages and not have a major woman character. So that would have really put me out in the cold. So I did need a strong woman character, and fortunately, Ratan Devi was one of the few women who gave evidence to the Congress Inquiry Committee. And it's amazing because in the pictorial depiction of Jallianwala Bagh in movies and all, sometimes you show a lot of women victims,
Yeah.
and you'll be surprised that there were hardly any women there. And there were, in the entire list of actual victims, or you could only find a handful, 3 4 people, and so, because women were not going out to political gatherings in those days,
Yeah.
and it was Baisakhi, etc., so women were at home, and so there weren't too many women in the crowd. There were children. There were a lot of children because it was a kind of a tamasha, and children were out in the garden or in the bagh, which was not hardly a garden. So secondly, I wanted to bring in a strong woman character because through her eyes, I talk of the village life, the socio-cultural life in Punjab at that time, the sort of belief that she had in in the Golden Temple, at the same time in the peers and in the mazars, and in the devis, or the of those days, that so and so can cure this, so and so can cure this, so and so and this entire thing, which was so mixed up. And I wanted to bring that out, and the role of a woman as to how she lived in the village, how she grew up virtually as an orphan, taken over by her aunt and uncle, and then how she survives and becomes strong. So, you needed that. And then, of course, the fact that I could place her in the massacre
Yeah.
just after the shooting. And, that allows you to increase the pathos of the moment, if I may say.
Yeah, but I was struck by, I think, something you said in another interview about the book, and you said we don't even know exactly how many people were killed. We only have the official figure. That official figure is by a British Commission of Inquiry.
Yeah.
I mean, that is extraordinary. Do you not think that we as a nation maybe should have excavated our own truth post-independence? Why do you think this never happened?
I don't know why it never happened, but there was a lot of there was a martial law imposed immediately. Very little news or information was coming out. Several large parts of the crowd were not from Amritsar. They had come from outside. There were people who had come for the cattle fair, which used to be held. The biggest cattle fair in Punjab used to be held in Amritsar on Baisakhi. There were people who had come to visit the Golden Temple and were just resting there. And there were some local people. So people tried to trace them out. People were scared to come forth because they thought if we say we were there, then we'll get into more trouble. So there was a Seva Samiti, which was a kind of a, what we'd call an NGO today, which was working to help cremate unclaimed bodies or bury them. Which was actually then going from house to house and asking for details. At the same time, there were independent people who came, like Madan Mohan Malviya came and said, did a survey, and he concluded that there were at least 1,000 people died. Now, Mahatma Gandhi at one stage said there were 1,500 people who died. because he was arranging compensation for them. And then the Seva Samiti came up with a figure somewhere, I think 500 or 600 people, and the British authorities had to finally admit a figure, and the 379 was a kind of a reluctant compromise that they issued. Their actual figure was even less than 379. So it's now believed by modern researcher. I mean, there are books like Kim Wagner and others who've recently done historical sort of non-fiction books would place the figure anything between, I think, 500 to 600 to 700 people died, and at least 3 times that number were injured. So somehow we never did get down to doing an exact.
Yeah, it's like knowing, it's like knowing your history in tropes, but not really knowing the specifics. And that's the other point you've made about how every time we talk about Jallianwala Bagh, we now revisit the great revolutionaries, Bhagat Singh, Udham Singh, men who got dwarfed actually by the way we were all taught history in school. They were bit-sized paragraphs in most of our textbooks. Maybe because of the emphasis on non-violence as the instrument of what gave us our azadi, and that's what the world noticed. But in your revisiting of these men, the fact that Udham Singh's remains are handed back to India, what, in 1974? Please correct me if I'm wrong. I think so, in 1974. Talk a little bit about these revolutionaries, what we know, what we don't know. One of the comments you made was the way we now know them is almost a caricature.
Exactly. And now, they were actually, if you read Bhagat Singh's own writings, you don't have to read much more to realize that he was an immensely remarkable man. I mean, he was 23 when he was hanged. He had read immensely. I mean, just when he was about to be hanged, he had asked for the works of Lenin to be sent to him. And, he was reading, he had educated himself, he had become a fluent writer, and he had his own way of thinking, of his philosophy of true revolution. And it didn't mean just killing people. I mean, he threw a bomb in the Legislative Assembly along with Barkha Dutt and refused to move from there. He did not try to escape because his aim was not to target or kill. His aim was to attract attention to India's cause. And so, he was a very different kind of person who had drawn his inspiration from his uncle, Ajit Singh, who was a revolutionary, from the Gadarites. He regarded Kartar Singh Saraba, the 18-year-old Berkeley student who came and fought for the Gadarites in India and was hanged, as his guru. And in due time, Udham Singh, who at one time was jailed along with Bhagat Singh by coincidence in Miyawali jail. No, not in Miyawali, in a jail in current Pakistan, present day Pakistan, was actually he used to treat Bhagat Singh as his guru. And he was completely besotted by the fact that, this is the way to do it. He could do it. I will also do it. And he nursed this spirit of revenge. Now, you're right that we, in a sense, we never ever gave them the square place in history that we should have. And even now, when, Udham Singh, as you pointed out, was 24 years. He was 34 years. He was buried in an unclaimed patch of unnamed, layered graveyard, which is a patch of land in Pentonville prison, which I actually visited as part of my research. And there's nothing there. But somehow they knew that in a particular layer 6 or 5 down there was this Indian revolutionary. And in 74, when we made a strong move back from the government on the behest of the Punjab government and central government, and we got his remains back, and he was honored in India and given a proper cremation. But the fact remains that, why I say caricature, I mean, you have to just see the statue outside Jallianwala Bagh of Udham Singh. It looks nothing like Udham Singh. And I was shocked when I visited the little pictorial library that they had about 3 or 4 years ago. There's a picture of Udham Singh in the dusty corridor that is there, and it's the wrong Udham Singh. There was an Udham Singh who was a Gadarite. and they put up his picture. And I tried to point it out to people. I don't know if it had any effect or impact or was ever changed. And Bhagat Singh, you see Bhagat Singh today on the back of every three-wheeler, on the back of buses, on bullock carts, on trucks, and everybody wants to sort of, lay claim to Bhagat Singh's legacy, etc., etc. But, it's not that you show him with a gun and a cap and think that, that's all there was to it. I mean, it's sometimes amazing as the kind of places you see his picture in. I think it is almost amounts to disrespect.
Because he's been appropriated basically by politics.
Yes, I mean that of course inevitably happens, but as long as his true contribution is recognized, his as long as his sacrifice is recognized, this is something. Of course, Bhagat Singh much more has been recognized because of than Udham Singh and others because of the famous Shaheed movies that have been made, and particularly the Manoj Kumar Shaheed, which essentially I think should be in terms of nation building should be made essential watching for every school going kid, I think, because it essentially tells you the story of tremendous sacrifice, and that's the kind of celebration not of violence but of complete devotion and sacrifice, and without any idea of self-interest, without any ambition politically, without even people say he was not a Sikh in that sense. He was an atheist by his own claim.
Yeah, but identities are cultural
Yeah.
and ethnic and
No,
national
that
as
is
well.
true. That is true. But what I'm saying is that they were acting out of pure nationalist motives, on a very large scale. And so, yes, we should claim him for what he was. We should claim his ethnicity. We should claim the fact that he was Bhagat Singh. We should claim the fact that he was Punjab. But we should also claim that he was educated. He had a larger philosophy, and he decided that he was going to sacrifice himself for a particular cause.
Yeah, and extraordinary to think of him being 23, as you mentioned, when he goes to the gallows. I do want to ask you in the end, when you serve as a diplomat all around the world, among those countries is United Kingdom. It's long been debated about the kind of reparations that are owed to India. We've got some measure of apology for what happened at Jallianwala Bagh. Is it enough?
We actually haven't got an apology. And, every year you will see that, because the last thing that was expressed by Theresa May was deep regret.
Yes, yeah.
And, so then there you can parse that and say that that's as far as things go. And countries don't actually apologize, be that as it may. I think what's happened today is that the world has actually moved on. And, in the current day and age, nobody is going to defend ever in England or Britain or anywhere in the world what Dyer did. There is this strong movement for reparations, for returning art objects, for a kind of the entire woke culture, which is that that these were things. At the same time, we can keep looking for a gesture which is satisfy us and give us closure. There may not be such a gesture, and the only healing can be done by time. So to that extent, my book probably takes away that healing for a while.
Well, I was just going to argue the opposite, that Ashish Nandi had this seminal work on memory and partition, where he argued that you can't heal till you confront memory. And I'm not sure that this nation, as a collective, there could be entire generations that don't even know what happened at Jallianwala Bagh, who was General Dyer, till they see it in some Netflix version of the truth, Navtej. So I think reading your book is can hurt at times, but it is essential part of healing. So thank you for this book and for your work. Crimson Spring by Navtej Sarna, reimagining and revisiting both the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, a gruesome massacre that changed the direction of India's quest for independence. A must read in so many different ways, not just for what you learn and that you may have forgotten from your textbooks, but also as a work of fiction for the characters and for the spirit of Punjabiyat that it captures, and for the spirit of Amritsar that it captures so eloquently. Thank you, Navtej. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Barkha. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.